I recently acquired this vintage Osborne 486-33 ISA machine. It's in pretty bad shape, so today we're going to be restoring it. Let's get started. I should note that I didn't just get the computer, I also got the matching keyboard and monitor, which makes this a pretty nice set overall, since it's all matching and Osborne branded. Around the year 1991 when this computer was made, it would have been top of the line pretty much, featuring the then brand new Intel 486 DX33 CPU. Turning our system around, as we see on the back, it appears to have a lot of expansion cards installed, which probably aren't original. This leads me to suspect that this system might have been upgraded by someone, so let's have a look inside and see what we're dealing with. Since this is a desktop AT case, it's really easy to see what's inside, since we just have to take the lid off. And I can't immediately really see anything, so I'm gonna have to remove the expansion cards quickly, so let's do that now. The first card in the system appears to be a proprietary CD-ROM interface card. This was common to see with early CD-ROM drives. Moving on to the second card in the system, as we see it appears to be an ESS audio drive sound card. These things were pretty stock standard at the time and there's nothing too special about them, but they definitely work well. And finally, the last card in the system, a generic S3 Verge video card. It's got a lot of RAM installed, so it must be kind of decent, but still, S3 are just average. Now I'm going to remove all of the rear I/O from the system so I can work closer towards pulling the motherboard out. And after a bit of fiddle-faddling, I managed to get it out. As I suspected, this isn't the original motherboard within the system. It's a PC Chips M919, which is a pretty notorious motherboard for having fake cache. You may be thinking you could just install some real cache in that coast slot, right? Well, no, it's actually a proprietary slot which requires a special cache module just for this motherboard. Bloody PC Chips. So yeah, this system was definitely upgraded at some point, but let's have a look at what CPU they chose to use. And the cheapness doesn't just stop at the motherboard, we have one of those Texas Instruments DX280 CPUs. Look, don't get me wrong, these things perform okay, but they're not Intel or anything, so yeah. As the case badge on this computer suggests, it was a 33MHz 486 ISA system. Now, this tells us that this motherboard was definitely an upgrade. So, let's put it back to something which it would have originally came with. Here I have an MG 486 motherboard, which is all ISA, has heaps of cache, and features an Intel 486 DX33 CPU. This motherboard would have been a boss back in 1991, and you may recognise it from the YouTube short I did a little while ago. This thing is almost the perfect motherboard for this system, and is a really accurate representation of what it would have come with. So yeah, I think this will be much more fitting to install in the system, rather than that crappy PC Chips board. And yes, the ultimate goal of this restoration is to restore it to what it would have originally been from the factory, so yeah, this board is perfect. Before we install that motherboard, I want to take this opportunity to just tidy up the case a bit, and also remove all of the drives in the front of the case. You may be asking, why would I remove the drives? They look pretty period correct. Well, the answer is that this computer would have actually only come with a 3.5-inch floppy drive originally. No 5.25, and no CD-ROM. What it would have come with is two of these Osborne style drive bay covers. These gave the case a really clean aesthetic, and in my opinion look much better than having a CD-ROM and 5.25-inch floppy drive. I actually got these off of another Osborne system I have, and yes, I have two of these. I was gonna make a video about the 386 one I have, but I couldn't get it working in the end, so yeah, that got canned. But as we see, after installing those drive bays into this system, it's starting to look a lot more original now, which is just how I like it. Now it's time to install our MG motherboard into the system, but before we can do that, I'm going to install some RAM into it since I just realised it has none. Here I'm installing 4MB of RAM, but I actually later upgraded it to 8MB, which I didn't video. With that taken care of, now we can install the motherboard into the system, and it was pretty tricky to get in there, but I managed eventually. Now it's time to wire up the front I/O of the case. I thought this would be easy, but after I realised there was no actual labelling on all of the connectors, it became a daunting task. I had to pull the front plastic off of the case so I could see where all the wires actually go and determine what they are. I eventually managed to get the front of the case off, and then after having a look at all of the circuitry on the front, I was able to figure out what all of the wires do and where they should go. This took me about 40 minutes overall, so this is a really bad case design. Now it's time to plug in the AT power connector to the motherboard. The power supply in this system has been upgraded, and it's actually a really good Seasonic one, so I won't be swapping it out with something more original since I'd prefer the reliability of this Seasonic one over something older and less reliable. Now it's time to install the video card into the system, and I'll be using this Eagle VGA video card. It's really period correct, and it just looks really nice. That's my main reason for installing it. But yeah, it should be a nice fit overall. And then we have the I/O card I'll be installing, which is just a pretty generic one, but you know, it serves its purpose. It's gonna be a pretty bland system, and the reason I'm only installing 2 cards is because you can actually see on the back of the case here how it says what cards were originally installed, and there's no sound card, none of that, and I want this system to be fully original, so yeah, I'm just going to install what it would have originally had and nothing more. Oh, and of course I completely forgot to install the IDE connector and the floppy disk connector onto the multi-IO card. There we go. Now it can be easily installed into the system. And I tried to put the video card in the correct slot, but that's actually an 8-bit ISA slot, so I had to put it just in the one above, so that way it was in a 16-bit slot. I've decided I'm also going to install a heatsink fan onto the DX33 CPU. This really isn't necessary because the DX33 doesn't get that hot, but still it's just to prolong the lifespan of this computer, and I think it's well worth it. Now for the final piece of the puzzle, the hard drive solution. And in this case I've gone with a compact flash to IDE adapter and a 128MB compact flash card. This isn't original, okay, yes, I have broken the period correctness here, but old hard drives from this era, although I do have a few of them, they're all dead, so using a CF card is just going to be much more reliable and should make this system last for a lot longer. Now it's time to install the lid back onto the system, and at this point the internals of this computer is pretty much complete, but the restoration doesn't stop here, this thing is still filthy. Speaking of which, now begins the laborious process of cleaning this thing. There really isn't much that can be said about the cleaning process, so just enjoy this little montage. Now it's time to clean the keyboard, which is actually in pretty good condition as is, but it could definitely do with a wipe down. Now for the part I've been dreading the most due to its awkward angles and multiple crevices and cracks, the CRT monitor. However, what I quickly discovered was this thing was actually incredibly filthy. And when I say incredibly filthy, I mean incredibly filthy. You see, it had smoker's residue all over it. and I mean a lot of smoker's residue. So much so, in fact, that I initially thought this monitor was actually really yellowed. But as it turns out, no, it's just smoker's residue. Yuck. On the back of the monitor here, you may be led to believe that this is going to be unremovable, but watch as I give it a wipe down with my cleaning solution. Yeah, all of that residue just comes straight off. This thing looks like it came out of a tobacco factory. And it surprisingly doesn't actually smell too bad. I think it hasn't been smoked around in 20 odd years, so the smell's kind of dissipated a bit. But yeah, it's pretty satisfying to see all of that smoke residue just wipe off like that. You don't see it often, so it's a cool experience. Just from that small amount of cleaning, as we can see, pretty much all of the residue is gone, or at least on the back. If only it was this easy to remove every kind of yellowing old computer's face. And just like that, our restoration is complete. We've successfully cleaned up this Osborne computer and made it almost factory original. Now let's try it out. And would you look at that, it boots up first go. How awesome is that? This is a really cool system, and I'm glad it works again. This system has a really ancient BIOS, which means we need to enter all of our hard drive parameters manually. There's no auto detect function here. Luckily, I have a photo of the CF card's parameters, so it's pretty easy to just go ahead and enter them in as such. The other annoying thing about this board is the fact that it's missing its BIOS battery, which I removed due to the fact that it was leaking. Now, thankfully it did not damage the board, but it now means that I'm going to have to enter these hard drive parameters every time I boot up the computer, unless I wanted to install a CR2032 solution. Once that's taken care of though, we can successfully boot into MS-DOS. This compact flash card already has all of the stuff I need on it, so it's a relatively simple process to get it running. As I mentioned before, this computer has no onboard sound, so games are pretty unbearable to play, but nonetheless, here's a few. Doom seems to run pretty slowly, and this is with turbo enabled. Now, despite common belief, it really depends on the system and how you have the turbo button hooked up as to whether pressing it makes it faster or slower. In this case, having the turbo enabled makes the computer faster, so it's running at full speed here. And yeah, the results are less than ideal, but it's pretty good considering it's a 33 MHz CPU. A game like Wolfenstein 3D, however, runs almost perfectly on this system. As we can see, it's more than playable and is a really smooth experience. Now, at the time of filming this, I didn't have a mouse hooked up to the computer, so it was a bit tricky to play the game, but I did hook up a mouse a bit later on. Trying out some Prince of Persia next, it appears to run pretty well on this system. I've never really been that good at this game. I should watch a tutorial on how to play it, but I've always liked how it looks. And now on to the last game, Lemmings. This is one of my favourites, honestly. It's kind of annoying not having sound, so yeah, I might end up installing a Sound Blaster 16 in this system, but it's definitely playable either way, you know. It runs really smooth, and yeah, all the Lemmings shall be saved. Well, that's about it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed this restoration, and I'll see you next time.